ZARA is the world's premier high street fast fashion store, and there is no sign of them stopping. So today I wanted to look at some of the factors of how they became as big as they did and analyze/explain why they worked for the time period in which they were implemented. So, ZARA actually began as Zorba in central A Coruña in Galicia, Spain, by partners Amancio Ortega and Rosalía Mera. Neither were from particularly wealthy families, but both had worked for a few years in retail. Between the two, they had experience in all of design, manufacturing, and front-of-house retailing. In fact, this is how they met when they were both working for a store named La Maya. However, while that's not directly related to ZARA, one part of their combined history is. You see, in 1963, Amancio and Rosalía founded Confecciones Goa as a dressing gown store along with Amancio's brother, half-sister, and backer Jose Antonio Caramelo. This was founded because during their time in retail, they realized that the supply chain was a huge cost to their companies, as usually small fees would be taken from every part of the supply chain. A little from the factory, a little from the distributor, sometimes an agent or finder's fee included, and they realized that if they cut out all of that and took everything from design to manufacturing and distribution, even small things like pricing and tagging in-house, then they would be able to transfer all of that cost saving onto the product, undercutting their competitors by price while maintaining the same great quality. This was the founding concept of Confecciones Goa, and it worked very, very well. It's just, after one buys one dressing gown, one tends not to have much need for two or three. So they took the money that they had earned from Confecciones Goa and pivoted, opening Zorba with the same logistical concept behind it on May 15th, 1975. The first Zorba store was on 64 La Calle Juan Flores and was to sell clothing for men, women, and children under the same roof with the same logistics model, vertically integrated and particularly lean. Now, I'm not planning on talking about the ZARA/Zorba, design in this video. Really, that needs its own video somewhere down the line. However, I will say that some sources say that from the get-go, their designs were already knockoffs of designer brands. Others simply don't mention it. I cannot know for sure which of these is true. But this was already a common practice by this point. It certainly was not invented by ZARA/Zorba. And I will say that by the 1970s, this is when designer fashion was beginning to go truly mainstream, with major designers opening ready-to-wear in the mid to late 60s and retargeting their names to the masses for the first time, causing a demand for fashion like never before. And with stores like Bieber, who sold low-cost, fashionably desirable garments running successfully until the early 1970s, demand for quantity of clothing sold by the desirability of the brand was also at its peak. Therefore, it is certainly possible that that was the initial appeal to Zorba/ZARA from a customer perspective. And yet, while I can't say that for certain, I can say that the store, firstly, very quickly, almost immediately, changed its name to ZARA because a bar a few streets away had the same name. And secondly, it was an enormous success right off the bat, regardless of what their actual clothing was. We don't know specifically. Within only 2 years, they had opened stores across Spain and opened a large warehouse in the Coruña town of Arteixo in 1977 in order to horizontally expand their production. This marked a huge change for the company as they went from individualized distribution to their one and only store to organized and controlled distribution of styles amongst several. What ZARA had succeeded in was creating a supply chain that was highly vertically integrated and as lean as possible. Lean here meaning without stored surplus or waste. Of course, we discussed how ZARA used the idea of taking everything in-house in order to save money, passing that on to the consumer, but there were actually more benefits to the model than just that. You see, by having the entire chain in one location, this meant that not only was it cheaper, but it was faster. Up to 12 times faster, in fact, according to Newsweek. ZARA was able to design, manufacture, and distribute clothing to each of their Spanish stores within weeks, It was down to 3 to 6 weeks at this point, if my memory of my uni lectures on ZARA is correct, and it did reduce from here significantly too, which compared to the 6 months that it was taking designers who were forced to wait on factories and distributors that were being outsourced, that meant that ZARA was always, by months, the first to have the latest fashion and always certain to have it at a cheaper price anyway. So why would a consumer wait to pay more when they can pay less now for pretty much the same garment? Furthermore, this era of the ZARA logistics plan was unique in that actually, instead of only doing on-demand production, it was copying the Bieber model of only producing a certain amount of garments. So for those of you that haven't seen my Bieber video, they were the world's first fast fashion brand. They changed styles constantly to keep up with fashion and were so desirable that they could literally never keep up demand by the end of it. So instead, they flipped the idea of making things to order and instead made a limit on how many garments they would produce, 500 of each design only, which meant that demand hit the roof as people knew if they didn't buy it today, it would be gone by tomorrow. In these early days, ZARA imitated exactly this. They limited production of clothes to only a few styles for each store, which drove up desirability due to scarcity. It made customers buy more and, very importantly, meant they came back frequently to see the new styles, lest they miss out. Naturally, from a consumer perspective, this was ridiculously successful and saw that they were the most desirable brand in all of Spain, far outpacing their competitors from the consumer side, while simultaneously guaranteeing the business a larger profit margin because not only was everything in-house cutting the external company costing, but they had no warehouse of stock, no inventory to cost the company warehouse space. The only downside, of course, being that if a style wasn't successful, it would have to go on sale or be wasted, causing an unfortunate loss for the company. But for now, that was quite minimal, and this was genuinely really working. They streamlined their logistics to the nth degree while making themselves the most desirable, the most attended, and the cheapest brand on the market. ZARA was unstoppable. Literally, they were the best thing that Spanish retail had ever seen. So, they very easily could have sat at that point, just waited, expanding as needed into new markets, growing into new sectors, or maybe even licensing, but they didn't. Instead, in 1987, a new parent company was founded, known as Inditex, which allowed the parent company to become the owner of many of their direct competitors. Similarly to how Arcadia owned all of the British high street, Inditex would own Spain's, and would help the ZARA brand fund an expansion abroad because it helped cut costs even further as they brought in a fabric mill called Comdetel, who at 90% of all of their sales would soon provide 40% of all of ZARA's fabrics, speeding production up further due to more vertical integration and, I assume, cutting costs in the process. However, before we get into that, there are a couple of changes that were made in their supply chain that at least I couldn't find a date for. I really did look, bearing in mind I studied this in my university days. A good amount of time has gone into this. I have no idea what dates they were, so it's unclear exactly when they happened, but it's important to note that they did. So, number one, they rethought their dependence on limited products and went for a blended method of restocking. I literally just told you that ZARA began copying the Bieber model of scarcity marketing. However, this seemingly didn't actually last too long. I can't confirm when the change happened, as mentioned, but we do know that at some point this changed. So now instead of saying, here is 500 styles, that's your lot, instead they began sending 50 styles to each store, gauged how quickly they were selling out, and then produced more based on demand in a style called just-in-time production. If their store in northern Spain sold out quickly, they got a restock, while if the store in the south only sold one or two, they might be withdrawn, or the only few that they had sent would be placed on sale, meaning that it was much less of a loss for the company. In turn, this meant that their supply chain became even more lean than it already was, while each store was curated for the local consumer individually, meaning each store, firstly, was individualized, and secondly, was optimized to the T to make the most money while creating the least waste possible. And of course, because they owned the factory, all of this planning just came at very little cost. The second was they reduced production time by absorbing more local businesses. So a large part of ZARA's ability to make their production speed up was betting on local businesses. I believe the only part of the ZARA supply chain at this point that was not in-house was the production of textiles themselves, so yarn spinning and fabric weaving, for example. And again, if memory of my degree serves me well, they also began to limit the types of fabrics that they would produce in order to further reduce costs, i.e., if a certain trouser style didn't sell well, at least the exact same fabric could be used for a jacket. Actually, this is something you do still see today in ZARA. They tend to reuse a lot of the same fabrics, just in different garments, and it also explains their often limited color palette as well, something that today is much more of a signature, but it began very much as a way to reduce waste and cost, a necessity for their low price. And the third was their location planning next to luxury retailers. You've probably heard of the saying, location, 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 and this was no different for ZARA. But instead of opening on the high street to compete with brands that were at their price point, they began opening stores on more luxurious streets to compete with brands on their desirability level. ZARA was not a brand one bought because you needed trousers, they were a brand you bought because you wanted to be fashionable. So, by opening near equally desirable brands, gave ZARA an added desirability from proximity and allowed for the wealthier, high-end clients to be enticed into impulse purchasing due to the lower prices. Which I probably should mention, ZARA predated fast fashion as we know it today, so while they are on the mid to high end of the high street now, in terms of pricing, the cheaper competitors just didn't exist in the same way then, and certainly not in Spain, so they were actually seen as the cheaper brand at this point. So, all of these developments were done by 1988 when they expanded internationally for the first time into a store in Porto, Portugal, followed by store openings in New York in 1989 and Paris in 1990. Soon came Mexico in 92, Greece, Belgium and Sweden in 93, Israel in 97, Brazil in 2000, before Inditex, the parent company, was floated on the stock exchange, giving a huge financial boost to ZARA's expansion, which then boomed to Japan and Singapore in 2002, Ireland, Venezuela, Russia, and Malaysia in 2003, expansion into ZARA Home in 2003 in this specific store in Spain. I'm sorry, I do not know where this exact store is, but the annual report shows it launched exactly in this store, and then also expanded to 26 stores in 4 countries, so Spain, Portugal, Greece, and the UK, by January 2004, so about 6 months, after an incredible public response. This came slightly before ZARA expansions into China, Morocco, Estonia, Hungary, and Romania in 2004, then the Philippines, Costa Rica, and Indonesia in 2005, and finally, for now, Guatemala and Colombia in 2007, all totaling to more than 1,000 locations across the globe, most of which owned by the Inditex company themselves. ZARA was now a global force, and frankly, their logistics were so strong early on, they simply could not keep up with demand. They expanded their warehouses into 17 subsidiaries in Spain, across La Coruña and Barcelona, as well as offshore facilities in Malaysia, Brazil, Argentina, Vietnam, and Turkey. I'm sure there's more than this, but again, they're quite closed off about all of this. This is just what I could find by the years 2006, 2007. And to steal a line from Tocatli's 2007 paper, Global Sourcing Insights from the Global Clothing Industry, the case of ZARA, a fast fashion retailer, quote, "It appears that instead of ZARA changing the geography of jobs, the geography of competencies and jobs has changed ZARA." What they mean by this is that this actually saw that the famed ZARA model needed to adapt. And though they continued to be lauded for the logistical idea that we had discussed earlier, it was changing with the times. Sure, some of these facilities were running production in the reactionary just-in-time way that we discussed, but actually, the demand was for now far exceeding their capabilities. And so, over time, more and more became outsourced to other factories, which is how most production across fast fashion is produced, of course, but this meant they were slowly losing their differentiator of being one of the only high street retailers to still manufacture close to home, as opposed to using globalized manufacturing, which was growing popular in the 80s and 90s. This was supposedly the exception to the rule that in order to compete, one needed to get the absolute cheapest manual labor. ZARA was supposed to be proving the industry wrong. But of course this was going to happen, right? The landscape of fast fashion had already changed so much. From the 1970s, when fast fashion as a term didn't really exist, and everything could still be made locally at an affordable and competitive price point, to this point in the late 2000s, where they were playing on a global stage with competitors like Gap, H&M, and Topshop, all of whom had their own core audiences, their own branded differentiators. And now, because of offshore production having exploded in the 80s and 90s, they were producing in countries like China and Bangladesh, in which not only was the cost of labor significantly cheaper, but these very large companies could use their weight to push production prices as low as 15% lower than ZARA, which is really huge in manufacturing. Though ZARA managed to offset this by keeping their own production costs exceptionally low, paying less than half the standard industrial wage at around $500 a month to the Spanish and Portuguese workers, according to Forbes, and significantly reducing advertising costs to only 0.3% of their overall costs, down from the industry standard of 3 to 4%. Effectively, ZARA's logistics could no longer offer them a price advantage if they were to continue to own their own factories and pay their employees a wage higher than their competitors, even if it wasn't necessarily a fair-ish wage. This, as a result, evolved their manufacturing from mostly Spanish in-house fulfillment of supply on demand to producing limited stock of everything at various locations across the globe, adopting the same logistics plan as other high street retailers, albeit at around 4 times the amount of styles to their competitors. It's really hard to tell how widespread this was too, as I assume they continued some on-demand production for styles that sold surprisingly well at a minimum, but in a discussion with somebody who does need to remain unnamed that was in charge of ordering with ZARA stores, it's clear that already by the mid-2000s, a good portion of their logistics reverted back to individual store ordering what they assumed would sell for their store, instead of the very genius replenishment of the sample goods as they had famously expanded into. To quote my source directly, they said, quote, "At that time, there was always a limited amount of stock, so you had to gamble on whether anything would sell and order as much as you could before it ran out. If there was any more left the next time, you could order again. If it didn't come up again, it was tough." They would sometimes reintroduce the same lines later in the season, but these were often slightly different, usually lower quality, so it feels like that might have been just before that model came in. Neither of us knew when exactly this logistics plan was reintroduced, but it was noticed already by a very well-referenced 2005 book from Suzanne Berger named How We Compete, What Companies Around the World Are Doing to Make It in Today's Global Economy, that calls it a cross-fertilization of business practices. And from my source, it became noticed in stores at least by 2007, with an increased amount of sales if styles didn't sell and a decrease in quality, especially, as this person pointed out, with buttons. To quote Tocatli's paper directly, "As a result, ZARA is now less of an exception to globalization, a reputation that the retailer gained as a result of its business model, which some believed had the potential to shape the future geography of jobs." Of course, I'm truncating history a fair bit here to explain their loss of differentiators, because while that was happening, they started to differentiate in other ways. But for now, we will have to come back to that, because though the effects had begun now with the logistics, and the academics were quite concerned about what this, and also the changes at United Colors of Benetton, but we can't go into that now, meant for fashion in general, in a nutshell, they were worried that this meant the true end of the original Bieber idea of democratized fashion, i.e. the same quality clothes, usually locally made, just at a lower price point for those that genuinely needed it, offsetting that by quantity and not by loss of quality, and the beginning of these retailers cutting all corners in the pursuit of profit. It wasn't yet noticed by the public, but it would be very soon. You see, outwardly, they were still expanding dramatically quickly. Later in 2007, they launched ZARA Home online, and ZARA also launched very successfully in South Korea in 2008. However, It was literally only then, in the following calendar year, that the outsourcing and the need for a differentiator again would rear its needy head once more. You see, in 2008, they went through a minor rebrand to using this logo and adopting the business casual aesthetic that would come to be a huge trend in the 2010s, very much born from the 2008 financial crisis that really brought that minimalistic, safe look back into mass appeal. This aesthetic in itself would be their differentiator on the high street, while brands like Topshop and H&M would largely go for either geek chic or boho looks, which were the other defining trends of the time, in the West that is. So, in short, aside from their luxury-adjacent physical locations of stores, they had found another way to differentiate from their high street competitors, with their minimal, smart casual aesthetic that played up that Phoebe Philo, Christopher Bailey's Burberry, Philip Lim, Helmut Lang-esque looks. This was a really great thing. It played very well into their limited color palette and obviously was a great way to position them in the market in an aesthetic way. However, what was much less constructive was the new lens that their changing distribution had put onto their brand by this same point. As mentioned, they were now so big that they simply couldn't produce everything in-house, nor could they produce absolutely everything to the same speed that they once could, and they hadn't really been able to for a while. Except that meant that their contracted factories were now a liability. While other brands like H&M and Nike had already had ethical labor scandals, ZARA had been largely excluded from that because they were using so much in-house. At least until now. They had been beginning to have small scandals here and there, added into the scandals of other brands. Quote, "The company's desire to appear committed to Europe's manufacturing base is clear, but this commitment is now becoming less convincing. Consider, for example, the following, quote, in April 2005, 79 workers were killed when a Bangladeshi garment factory collapsed. Bodies were found in a grave of fragmented concrete, crushed bobbins, children's red pullovers ordered by the Spanish textile chain ZARA, Spiegel magazine 2005. Similarly, see the Financial Times' 2006 article on Vietnam's Vinatex, whose buyers not only include Nike, Liz Claiborne and Marks & Spencer's, but also ZARA. In fact, it is somewhat surprising that the retailer is still known for manufacturing a large proportion of its garments in its own factories in Spain. However, from my own research, I believe this was actually the first labor scandal of ZARA's to really be about ZARA specifically, coming after the Tocatli 2007 paper in the summer of 2008, when an outsourced factory in Bangladesh was found to be abusive to the mostly female workforce. Of course, because this is outsourced labor, they could claim, as they did and many before them had, that they had no idea of the treatment going on and that they didn't own the factory and so couldn't have that kind of control. And there is plausibility in that. They could have been misled. There is simply no way to know. But these are the risks of outsourcing and offshoring, and it didn't really stop from there. Over the years, there would be several labor scandals from outsourced facilities making ZARA clothing, though comparatively, very few of which had a large impact on the popularity of the company. In fact, other scandals that the ZARA company had significantly more impact on their public perception, which in my opinion was because comparatively to their competitors, they were the least bad. They had such a small reliance on these outsourced factories, comparatively to brands like H&M and Topshop, as they were only outsourcing styles that didn't need their famed quick turnaround, let's say plain jeans or t-shirts, so there was simply less dependence on outsourcing in order to cause a scandal. Even today, only around 35% of everything ZARA makes is outsourced, according to Medium.com, while in their annual reports every year they go over the demographics of their workforce in-house and the well-being of their outsourced labor, though the inspections are outsourced, so take that with a pinch of salt if you do look. So comparatively to other fast fashion retailers and even some high fashion brands, honestly, the risk is low, and their transparency in this is comparatively quite reassuring, hence why I believe it didn't have a massive impact on the popularity of the company. And so, they were largely unfazed. By August of 2008, they became the world's biggest retailer. By 2010, ZARA.com was launched, as well as expansions into India in 2010, which I believe came with a manufacturing facility, Taiwan, South Africa, and Australia in 2011, and then Peru in 2012. But with that said, their physical expansions would soon take a back seat to their online expansion. Quickly realizing that online would be the new frontier for fast fashion, ZARA put a lot of resources into expanding their reach with that specifically. They even closed some of their stores during this time, not enough to cause worry, but enough to make it clear that their focus was slowly shifting onto the digital side of the business, which was expanding both into new territories on an annual basis and in general with innovations on the site. Things like adding editorials, a bestsellers tab, and models' height and weight to help consumers understand fit better. This brings us, if we were going to jump quite away, all the way to 2018, where ZARA.com was near global. They had already expanded to most countries across the world, and they were defying industry growth still. They had a strong millennial following for their perceivably good product quality, even if the pricing was a touch higher. However, I bring up this year specifically as this was about the time that the online store began to feel dated. It once again didn't have a real differentiator from online brands like ASOS, who were running their websites similarly like catalogs, showing exactly the product one was going to buy as if it was in a showroom or literally as if it was in a catalog. Of course, there is nothing wrong with that if your goal is to sell the clothes, but if you think about it, few retailers today actually have that as their goal. Their job is to sell you their brand, their world building. That's what makes the products desirable, not the actual garment itself. For example, I'm pretty sure I can find a polo shirt. No, wait, let me do it with jeans. It'll be easier. So I'll put onto screen a whole bunch of retailers' jeans from their sites. I'm so confident about this, you can probably tell that I'm saying this before I've scripted it, before I've even looked it up. And what I'll do is I'll put as many as I can find on the screen, and I'll remove all of the logos or signifiers out of the images. Quick update during editing, these are all from the Selfridges website, nowhere else. If you're a consumer and I showed you these products without the price or without the fabric composition, because mostly we look at the composition after we look at the photo, which of these is the most saleable to you? Probably none of them, because they are so similar from an initial look. Now, if I add back in either their signifier or their logo back onto the designs, now some have more perceived value than others, even before you see the price. Now, if I add in actual brand names, some of them have, again, a different perceived value. Then if I add in the price, they have a cost X value consideration going on in yours/my head. What I'm trying to say is, we base our decisions on world building of the brand and the cost of a product far, far more than we do the actual design of the piece. No one is void of this decision because it goes in every direction. You find the brand and the price that best suits you, might be the cheapest, might be the most creative brand, might be the most reliable or the most expensive. But it's the branding of the company that will tell you all of those things. And that's not a bad thing. Even those of us that think we don't do this are still affected by it because of avoidance. It's just the foundation of all shopping. We even do this with food and medicine. And then you think we do this online, when none of those perceived indicators that you might get in a store, say the location, say the actual atmosphere of the place, all of that is gone. So how are you making the decision between a pair of Diesel jeans and a pair of Prada jeans? That is literally all done with the brand perception online. But what ZARA did was to translate their differentiator from it just being a boring logistical standpoint to realizing that really their differentiator came from the fact that that logistical infrastructure enabled them to differentiate on desirability. They always had the most styles, the most mix of styles. They always had the fastest delivery. They were the place that you would go to for the most fashionable, most desirable garments. And so for them to translate that online meant that they needed to rethink how one engages with their online space. What ZARA did was to realize this and figure out how to translate their world building, their value proposition into their online store with a rebrand. Late 2018, early 2019, they began to rebrand from online outwards. They began with odd model posing, mimicking old magazine shoots where everything was styled, not necessarily worn. They showed not how it could be worn, but how it would make you feel. It was odd and unusual and exciting. It literally had people making TikToks about how weird it was, and soon Zara became the most searched brand online. Sure, it's annoying in that you don't know if it will fit you, and sometimes it's really annoying when you can't actually see the garment at all. But in terms of fit, you never actually know with online shopping, even if you can see it plainly on the model, what something will look like on you. None of us look like the models, so it will literally never fit us like it fits them. So in that sense, why does it matter? You're going to send it back regardless if it doesn't fit. So instead, what Zara did was to propose their product shots in a magazine-like way to explain the emotional value to the consumer. I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, but they rethought online shopping, and that in itself is really interesting from a retail perspective. They made an extra 1.5 billion euros in revenue in 2019, while the whole parent company saw a 2% increase in online sales, more than doubling that again in 2020 as we entered into the pandemic. I tried to compare that with their competitors just so we get an idea of how successful that their online campaign had been, but unfortunately none of them segregate online versus in-store figures like Inditex does, so it's a bit of an unfair comparison. Just please know that I did attempt to do that. But needless to say, this new era of Zara, again, is proving to be really interesting from a retailing perspective. By the following year, their online sales grew again by 1.1 billion euros to 7 billion as they dubbed Oscar Garcia Macieras as their new CEO. Then 7.2 billion euros in 2022 as Marta Ortega Perez took over as chairperson. Although I should probably say that these figures are for Inditex as a whole, Zara does not solely contribute to these figures, it's just that they are by far their biggest contributor, after other brands like Bershka and Pull & Bear barely take 10% of what Zara does in sales, so at least it can be a decent indicator, even if it's not the full story with these figures. As it is, in terms of their logistics and the way that they are seeing their own company, this is pretty much where the brand is now. They're very, very much focused more on the online side, and in the rebrand that they started, I still see it as they're still going through, but they are also exploring other factors like franchising stores. 13% of their stores are franchised now, actually. This will reduce risk on things like physical location owning as the value of those places diminishes. And they have subsidiaries overlooking quite large swathes of their foreign stores. But largely, the main factor that has caused the meteoric rise of Zara has been their ability to notice an innovation before it needed to happen. In the end, Zara is a really fascinating company in that they have truly never been complacent with their position in the market, despite them being on top for literally decades at this point. Honestly, I know I didn't touch on everything that Zara did to get to where they got to. We didn't really talk in depth about their stores, how their merchandise, their product quality, their collabs, their social media, their lack of dependence on celebrities, their work by Carl Templar or Steven Meisel, nor did we talk about advertising and marketing changes over the years, just honestly because if we did, I would be here for many, many hours, and I'm already scared of editing this video because there is so little photogenic or video evidence that I could find of early Zara because Inditex is closed off in that way. With that said, if you are interested in any of the different angles that I've just listed about the colossus that is Zara, do let me know. I would be very happy to take a deep dive on the brand. I do think it's a really interesting company, despite not really knowing everything because they are closed off. And actually, if anybody from the brand watches this and would be interested in working together into distilling some of the things that you are working on, I'd really love to see the archives. I know the brand is mostly closed off to journalists, but I will shoot my shot regardless because I think that would be really fascinating and a great way to democratize the brilliance that has been the Zara logistics. And in general, to my viewers, I hope that you did enjoy this distillation of what made Zara successful as a retailer, and I hope you let me know your thoughts below of this more focused history video. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you did like it, please do like and subscribe down below. If you're interested in videos like this, but about beauty brands, please check out my beauty channel Underskin over here. And a special thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon, some of whose names are on the screen now. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.